Words can be powerful. If used with wisdom, they can end conflicts and even change the course of history. But not so in the cases where, instead of making use of their power, they are laid to waste by arguments based on personal pride, which only makes you foes and takes you nowhere in the long run. When trying to prove a point, it is better to use indirect measures, rather than trying to talk your way into making others understand, which carries terrible risks. These include being misunderstood and, most importantly, stoking the flames of ego, making others feel insecure. In 131 BC, the Roman consul Publius Crassus Mucianus was on the offense and attacking the Greek city of Pergamus. He needed a battering ram to break through the city's walls. A few days earlier in Athens, he had seen two large ship masts in a shipyard. He sent an order for the bigger mast to be sent to him right away. The military engineer in Athens who got the order was sure the consul really needed the smaller mast instead. He argued non-stop with the soldiers who brought the order, saying the smaller one would work better and be easier to transport. The soldiers warned him that their commander was not someone to argue with, but the engineer insisted the smaller mast was the only one that would work with the machine he was building. He drew many diagrams to prove his point, and told the soldiers they didn't understand what they were talking about. In the end, the soldiers convinced him to obey the order and send the larger mast. But after they left, the engineer thought it over and decided that sending the wrong mast would lead to failure. So he sent the smaller mast anyway, believing that the consul would realize it was better and reward him. When the smaller mast arrived, Mucianus asked his soldiers what had happened. They explained that the engineer had argued endlessly for the smaller mast, but had finally promised to send the larger one. Mucianus became furious. Instead of focusing on the siege and breaking through the walls before reinforcements arrived, he could only think about the arrogant engineer. He ordered him to be brought at once. A few days later, the engineer arrived and eagerly explained to Mucianus, once again, why the smaller mast was better. He repeated all the same arguments he had made before, telling the consul that it was wise to listen to experts, and that if he just tried the battering ram he had sent, he would not regret it. Mucianus listened until the engineer finished speaking. Then he ordered the man to be stripped naked in front of the soldiers and beaten with rods until he died. If you know you are right, never give in to the perverted desire to argue, because if you truly are, time is on your side, and the validity of your point or ideas will be advocated in a much better way, by silence itself. Truth is always seen, rarely heard. So what could be a better way to cancel all noise around you and prove your point than giving a calculated demonstration? While others talk this and that thing, you stick it in the face with a spectacle that runs home your point, without you saying a word. This is something that can be mastered with deliberate practice. There once lived a vizier had served his master for some 30 years, and was known and admired for his loyalty, truthfulness, and devotion to God. His honesty, however, had made him many enemies in the court, who spread stories of his duplicity, thus making him look untrustworthy. They worked on the Sultan day in and day out, until he too came to distrust the innocent vizier, and finally ordered the man who had served him so well to be put to death. In that realm, those condemned to death were tied up and thrown into the pen, where the Sultan kept his fiercest hunting dogs. The dogs would promptly tear the victim to pieces. Before being thrown to the dogs, however, the vizier asked for one last request. "I would like 10 days' respite," he said, "so that I can pay my debts, collect any money due to me, return items that people have put in my care, and share out my goods among the members of my family and my children, and appoint a guardian for them." After receiving a guarantee that the vizier would not try to escape, the Sultan granted this request. The vizier hurried home, collected 100 gold pieces, then paid a visit to the huntsman who looked after the Sultan's dogs. He offered this man the 100 gold pieces and said, "Let me look after the dogs for 10 days." The huntsman agreed, and for the next 10 days the vizier cared for the beasts with great attention, grooming them well and feeding them handsomely. By the end of the 10 days, they were eating out of his hand. On the 11th day, the vizier was called before the Sultan. The charges were repeated, and the Sultan watched as the vizier was tied up and thrown to the dogs. Yet when the beasts saw him, they ran up to him with wagging tails. They nibbled affectionately at his shoulders and began playing with him. The Sultan and the other witnesses were amazed, and the Sultan asked the vizier why the dogs had spared his life. The vizier replied, "I have looked after these dogs for 10 days. The Sultan has seen the result for himself. I have looked after you for 30 years, and what is the result? I am condemned to death on the strength of accusations brought by my enemies." The Sultan blushed with shame. He not only pardoned the vizier, but gave him a fine set of clothes and handed over to him the men who had slandered his reputation. The noble vizier set them free and continued to treat them with kindness. The lesson is simple. Instead of wasting time on perfecting your arguments, dedicate your efforts to perfecting your demonstrations. This way not only will you become untouchable, but also succeed in the long run. The best forms of persuasions are those where people come to their own conclusions, whereas you simply guide them towards that conclusion. Consider the following parable, which again demonstrates the divine power of action and demonstration. God and Abraham. The Most High God had promised that he would not take Abraham's soul unless the man wanted to die, and asked him to do so. When Abraham's life was drawing to a close, and God determined to seize him, he sent an angel in the guise of a decrepit old man who was almost entirely incapacitated. The old man stopped outside Abraham's door and said to him, "O Abraham, I would like something to eat." Abraham was amazed to hear him say this. "Die," exclaimed Abraham. "It would be better for you than to go on living in that condition." Abraham always kept food ready at his home for passing guests, so he gave the old man a bowl containing broth and meat with breadcrumbs. The old man sat down to eat. He swallowed laboriously, with great effort, and once, when he took some food, it dropped from his hand, scattering on the ground. "Oh, Abraham," he said, "help me to eat." Abraham took the food in his hand and lifted it to the old man's lips. But it slid down his beard and over his chest. "What is your age, old man?" asked Abraham. The old man mentioned a number of years slightly greater than Abraham's old age. Then Abraham exclaimed, "O Lord our God, take me unto you before I reach this man's age, and sink into the same condition as he is in now." No sooner had Abraham spoken those words than God took possession of his soul.